Okay, so let's get started on the more practical side of what we've been covering over the last few videos. So we're going to do a demo here, and we're going to be covering everything that we're going to be using, everything that we've covered until now. So everything from adding and transforming objects, deleting objects that we covered in some early videos, up into the functions that we covered in the last series of videos, which were extrude, delete, fill, join, loop cut and slide, subdivide, bevel, and inset. So I just started up with a new Blender file here, and I've tabbed over into the modeling workspace just to get rid of the animation timeline here at the bottom, just because I noticed over the last few videos it was sort of obstructing my keystroke capture here in the bottom. So just like the previous demos, I'm probably not going to describe every single thing that I'm doing because a lot of it is about repetition and learning those hotkeys, those shortcuts. But again, my keystrokes will be captured down here in the bottom left corner of the screen so you can follow along with what I'm doing. Okay, so I don't have a plan as such for what I want to demo with these tools, but in the last couple demos, we've been doing these kind of larger exterior scenes because we haven't really been able to go in and edit these meshes to be much more than primitives. So now that we know how to add and remove geometry and detail, we can do a lot more, and we can do it at a smaller scale. So I'm going to move into doing an interior scene just for a bit of a change of pace. So now that we can really manipulate these shapes, we can do a lot more. So I'm going to start, since I know I want to do an interior, I don't have a firm plan for what I'm going to put in it, but let's just start by building out the room itself. And now I'm not going to put like a ceiling or a fourth wall on this room, just so that we can see what we're doing. But, if this were like a 3D game environment you were building, you would have those things because when, if your perspective is inside the room, you'd want to be able to view it from all sides. But this is going to be more like a diorama almost. So we can just start with our default cube. Now I want to make some walls and doors and just sort of the major building blocks of this piece. So to do that, and in order to do that in a way in which everything lines up nice and evenly, I'm going to turn on grid snapping. And we went over this in a previous video, but we can do that by coming up here and clicking the snap icon, which is like a little magnet. And you can also press Shift Tab to toggle it on and off. So I'm going to turn it on. I'm going to press 1 to come into front orthographic, tab into edit mode. And you may be wondering why I'm so insistent on keeping the pivot points at the bottom when it doesn't seem to have mattered. This is honestly just good practice. And for me, coming from environment modeling for games specifically, when you bring pieces into your game engine, so you wouldn't program your game in Blender, but you would use another engine like Unity or Unreal. So you would make all your models in Blender, you would export them, and then you would import them into these engines. And when you import them, it's just a lot easier when you're placing things and duplicating them in Engine if the pivot's at the bottom, because those types of programs will snap your pivot to the ground so that just everything is lined up the way it should be, and it's just makes your workflow a little bit easier down the line. So although it may not have seemed to have mattered for some of the demos I've done, it is just good practice. Okay. So I guess for this, let's start thinking about our scale. So I did this, I think I covered this in the previous video, but I may not have. So the default cube that you start with is 2 by 2 by 2 meters. So let's say I want to make I'm going to not make this one of our final pieces. This is just going to be a tool that I use to get an idea for scale. So we're going to make this about the size of a door, because a door is a pretty universal thing and it's something that we all see every day. So it allows us to judge whether things are scaled appropriately. So we're going to leave the Z at 2 meters. We're going to put the X dimensions at about 1 meter. And these are all approximate. I mean, if you measure a door, it's not going to necessarily be exactly this. And then the Y doesn't matter quite as much. Again, this isn't going to be our door. This is more just a scaling reference. So I'm just going to put it at 1 meter. Okay. So this is the size of approximately a door and approximately a tall person. So I'm just going to rename this scale ref so that later I'm not confused by it. All right. So now I'm in object mode. I'm going to add a new cube. Snapping turned on still, you may notice that it's kind of it looks a little different when I'm sliding it once it's snapping on. Again, I forgot to move my pivot point after I just made that whole point about how you should always have it at the bottom for environment pieces. So if you look at a door just on sort of a normal wall, there's like a little bit of space between the top of the door and the ceiling. So again, this is not going to be like an architectural design piece, so it's not going to be exact. And you can use Blender for architectural design and things like that. You just have to be more careful about getting your measurements correct. So this is going to be our first wall segment, and there's a few conventions about how big and how wide you should make walls. It's largely up to you and the needs you have for your scene, but typically a door is 2 meters tall, and if you were building this for a game or even an animation, you would want your character model brought in here to make sure that they can fit through the doors and things, because if you model your whole scene based on a certain scale, you bring your character in and realize, oh, the character can no longer move through this door, I can't proceed with this, then you'd have to go back and redo it and tweak it, and it wouldn't be good. So let's make this section of the wall 4 meters long. And then there's some conventions regarding how thick your walls should be. Again, it depends on what you want to use this for. But there are some issues with having your walls be flat planes that can arise in some game engines. And what I mean by that is, instead of using a cube, if we used a plane, which is just a single face, it would work to make your walls this way. And if you weren't ever going to see move through this doorway or see the other side of this, you can absolutely use a plane. There's just sometimes issues with lighting. If you have an exterior light source, it might just bleed through a little bit because the engines have a harder time with it. So we're going to have a little bit of thickness to our wall, just like a real world wall. Say that 5 times fast. Okay. So since we know that this is approximately the size of our door, we can use this information to cut a doorway in using some of our delete functions that we learned. So let's select, and let's make sure we're trying to keep this a little bit organized for these longer demos. So let's name that. You can even name it maybe wall _ door, and whatever naming conventions you choose. It's largely personal preference. Obviously, if you're working for, some sort of studio, they'll probably have a naming convention they want you to follow. But if it's just a scene that you're working on by yourself, use whatever you like. So I've tabbed into edit mode on this wall, and I've pressed Control R to get my preview loop cut. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to bring it right in the center here, which brings it right in the center of our door. I'm going to scroll up on my mouse wheel once to make the cuts, think the number of cuts too. I'm going to click again. I want them exactly where they are. So now, because we have median point is the default transform pivot point, if we have both of these selected, which they will be as soon as you place them, if we press S and X and scale them out on the X, you can see that these edges slide in really nice. So we're gonna line these up with the size of the door, and we're gonna make another cut across right here. The same way, we're gonna hit Control R, get our preview, slide it up, and now we have the cut going all the way around. So let's hide our scale reference. And now we actually need to make a hole in this wall for the doorway. So let's go into face select mode and select the faces that we want to delete just by shift clicking again. X for delete menu and faces. So now we have this doorway that's appropriately sized, but we can see into the interior of our wall, so we just have to patch up these holes. We already know how to do that. We're just going to come down here, select this edge, press F, F, and F one more time to fill all the way around that loop. So we already have our first room piece. Now, let's move this off the center a little bit because I like to add and model things in the center of the screen, but that's totally personal preference. So let's make another wall piece, and let's make this one just like a plain wall with no doors or windows or anything like that. Plain. Tab into edit mode, move this up, wireframe to be able to select through everything. And you may be asking why I'm grabbing these faces and moving them with the G tool instead of scaling them. There's no reason. It's just a personal preference thing. I'd have to come in here and enable scale snapping to get it to snap if I use scale, which is no big deal. You can do it that way. You just come to the drop down in the snap, highlight scale, you can highlight everything if you like. And now if you select both of these faces in S and X, they will snap. So there's no real reason I'm doing one method over the other. It's just sort of a personal preference thing. So let's look at this. Let's see. I made this, I think I made this 20 centimeters. I believe that these grid lines are currently set to 1 meter each. Yeah, because this says 4, 3, 4, and this is 4 meters. So yes, so each of these little squares is going to be 10 centimeters. So my walls are 20 centimeters thick. So let's make this one 20 centimeters thick. Okay. Oh, I accidentally made it 30, and you can see because it says 0.3 meters. So I was off by 1. There we go. 0.2, we're good. 0.2. Yes, they match. Okay. So now we have a plain wall. We have a wall with a doorway cut into it, and let's make one more with a window. So to do this, I'm just going to move this to the side, but I'm just going to duplicate it just to speed up this process and make it from this shape. We can see we have wall plane .001 now because it's a duplicate. Let's rename it wall window. All right. Now most windows are roughly, the top of them are roughly aligned with the top of doors. And this can vary depending on, what type of building, but for like standard modern buildings, and I don't know a ton about architecture, as its own discipline, but for standard modern buildings, they seem to line up roughly with the top of the door. So now we could have duplicated this and added edge loops to it and filled it, but I think it's actually just going to be easier. And now to do it from here, and because this piece is directly behind this piece on the Y, just where I've placed it for now, when I hit 1 to go into front orthographic, It's lined up perfectly. So if I select our wall underscore window, go into one, hit one on the numpad to move into front orthographic, and now I tab into edit mode, I can still see these guidelines because I'm in wireframe. I'm looking through this mesh, so I can see the guidelines of the mesh behind it, which is going to make it easier to make these lines be where I need them. So now I have this cut horizontally across the mesh, and it's at the exact height that this one is. So how tall you want to make your windows is largely up to you. Typically they're roughly rectangular. I'm just trying to visualize between this and this. Let's make it this one. We can always move it. Now, same thing with these guidelines here. We're going to match basically the width just to keep things simple. So all I've done is hit Control and R, hovered over this edge to get my preview, and scrolled up once on the mouse wheel to double it. And I've double clicked to place it exactly where it is. We could also add the number of cuts afterwards by accessing this loop cut in slide menu down here. So S and X, scale it in. Now you'll see that this isn't lining up exactly, and I believe that is because I did not have scale snapping enabled when I made this door. I think I just eyeballed it. So we're going to turn snapping off quickly, and we're just going to come in, and I'm just box selecting to select the entire loop. You can also, of course, hold Alt and click it. I'm just going to zoom in so I can see where this is, and I'm going to hit G and X and transform. And I'm going to do the same thing over here, G and X. Okay, so now we have all of our loop cuts in place. So now all we have to do, same thing we did for the door, is select the faces that we want to delete, which is a little bit easier to see in solid viewport shading. So I've just selected both those faces. I'm going to hit X, and I'm going to delete the faces. Now, again, we just want to fill these. Let's select two edges. Actually, we can select, yes, two edges and 4 vertices and fill this whole quad. So now if we just select this edge, because there is this quad drawn, Blender sees that and says, oh, I get it. You want it to fill in this way. So now if I just hit F, I don't have to make the whole selection. All right. So we have our initial pieces here. So let's think about how we want some of these arranged. And let's add a floor in while we're at it. Now, for the floor, I am going to use a plane, just because you don't typically have the same issues with light coming through. And again, this is sort of a more advanced topic, and it's not really something you need to worry about at this stage, but I do just want to explain why I use certain pieces over other pieces at times. So I typically use planes for the ground because you don't typically have a light source underneath something, so you don't have to worry as much about light coming through. So I have snapping on. Let's just scale it up so it's 4 by 4, so it just matches the width. Yeah. Now we can start duplicating some of these objects around to build out our room. So I'm going to go into top view because I like using top view for laying out things. Just moving this to the side a little bit because I think I want the door to be here. Let's bring it in by 20 centimeters, just so that it's sitting on this plane. Now we can grab some of these and start moving them around. So now let's start duplicating this floor for wherever we need it. So, and you could, scale this and extrude some of these edges to make the floor the shape you need. But for consistency and just ease of placement, I think it's better. It's called the modular workflow, and it's something that is used a lot in games. It's easier to make things sort of a standardized size and then just duplicate them. And it also helps with like when you add textures. So if I had a sort of like a wood floor running on this with like the wood floor planks, I won't get in too much into detail about that because that's going to be a future video, is texturing, but just know that it would be easier to texture a single square plane than it would be to texture something that is like extruded into like a funky L shape. So I don't think I want a window right here next to the door. I think I'm gonna duplicate this wall out. Place it, rotate it. And because I had rotate turned on in the snapping, I was able to just quickly and accurately make it 90 degrees. I think I am gonna put the window over here. So you'll notice with the snapping that if I'm really zoomed out, I can't snap to like the 10 centimeter increments before. We talked about this a little bit in the lecture. So if you notice that it's not snapping to small enough increments, you just have to zoom in until you can see these grid lines that you need to snap them to. Let's do another regular wall right here. You'll see because I made the floors and the walls all the same width in their local X direction that it just makes it a lot easier to build things out with proper placement. So you can think of this as like a diorama, like, I don't know, maybe you're playing a top-down game and, you know, like The Sims or something, and when you look into your houses, you know, there's no walls or ceilings obstructing, so you can see what's going on. So think of it like that. That's a good start. It's just a little square room, which is a little bit boring. So let's add a little bit of variation. I'm gonna do that by rotating some of these walls and making just more interesting configuration. Okay, so that's a good sort of starting point for this. Oops, DC90. Okay, cool. So now let's think about what we can add to give this a little bit more life. So obviously we need actual windows and actual doors, not just these holes cut into our mesh. So let's do that. Now this doorway is, again, not perfectly on the world origin, but it is aligned on the X axis. So when I press 1 on the numpad and come in here, you can see this doorway is being cut exactly in half by this axis line. So it's just going to make it very easy because it's all lined up with the center of the world to make a door. So actually you can do that. You could just add a new cube and scale it, or if you like, you can just use the scale ref. You can just rename it to something like door and then just scale from here, just because it's a little bit closer to the shape we need already. It's a little bit quicker. And now that we have our doorways cut and things like that, we don't really need the scale reference anymore because we can just look at our doorway or our windows. Just placing that right in the center. We're going to need to make a frame for it at some point too, because it's going to look strange if we don't. Yeah, so let's look at this. Now, I'm going to show you a shortcut that we have not discussed in the lectures, and this is just a sort of a view mode shortcut. So if you have a lot of objects in your scene and you're trying to view them from angles and things are obstructing it, and you're like, well, I could go into wireframe, but I really, I want to see this object solid. You just want to see it alone. You could select everything and press H to hide it, but the quicker way to quickly view an object in isolation is to click on it and click the slash key on your keyboard, and that will put you in like local view, which basically just hides everything else that was not selected in your viewport. It just hides it temporarily for you. Now, if you press Alt H, it won't bring it back because this is a different functionality than the H key. You have to move out of local view, and you'll know you're in local because up here where it says user perspective, it will say local. So to move out of local view, all you have to do is press the slash key again, and it will bring everything back. So if you just need to quickly focus on one piece, that is how you do it. So we've made a couple doors up until now, but we haven't really been able to add a lot more detail other than just like putting in a doorknob because we weren't able to edit our mesh and find enough detail, but now we can. So let's add a loop cut just right in the middle. And I'm thinking about those doors that have sort of the inset panels. So we do know how to make an inset, and that is with using inset. So let's select every face, and whether or not you want to do the back face is up to you. If I just move out of local view, so it depends what your scene is for. If this door is going to open at any point, you would want to model the back face because you would see it. But if it's just going to stay closed and it's just going to be a static shot, you don't necessarily have to model the back face. Okay, slash again to go into local view. I'm going to press I. And you see that it's coming in as one, but I put that cut in the center because I wanted to. So I'm just going to press I again to turn on individual. All right. And I want to scale these in on the X a little bit. Cool. So now I want to bring these panels in because if I tabbed into object mode right now, I haven't moved these off the surface at all, so it still appears flat even though these cuts and vertices have been added. So I'm going to press E and S and then Y to scale it on the Y, and I've turned snapping off for this just because I want a little bit finer control. Cool. So in order to see this better, we can come up here and turn on cavity the way we have, but you'll notice that when I press 1 to view it from the front, you still can't see it, even though the inset is there. And that is just because these edges, these faces are perfectly flat to the world. It's just something to know that when you are looking at something that is perfectly flat from a perfect front view, you just won't be able to visualize it. So there's a couple of tricks we can do to make this visible from the front. So let's tab back into edit mode. Our selection is still active. Let's change our transform pivot point to individual origins and press S and scale these in a little bit. So now this face isn't perfectly aligned to the world, and this face is a little bit smaller, but when you come into front view, you can now see it because we can now see these edges properly. Okay, looks so far so good. Let's add our door. Shift right clicking to move my 3D cursor so I can quickly add a cylinder in the correct spot, well, approximately the correct spot. I'm going to press R, X, and 90 to flip it this way. I'm going to scale it down. Scale and shift Y because I don't want to affect the length of it this way right now. And then I like to do this as I go. You can model everything in with flat shading and then come in and fix it, but I like to do it as I go. It just helps me visualize what I'm doing. Let's come in here, select this face loop by in face select mode, holding Alt and clicking, right clicking, and selecting shade smooth. Let's add a UV sphere for the actual knob part. Rotating it 90 degrees along the X, which you can do by pressing R, X, and then 90, or by hitting 3 on your numpad and then just typing in R and 90. Again, because when you're viewing it from orthographic, it will only transform in the directions that you can view it. Shading it smooth there just to get a better idea. And then the same way we did this before, we're going to tab into edit mode on this, grab a single vertex at the front. We're going to turn on proportional editing by either clicking this icon or pressing O on the keyboard, grabbing, pressing Y for Y, and then we're going to scroll to change our influence just so we have this shape that's round here and flat here like a doorknob. And now we're just gonna play with the scale until it looks approximately right. I think it's a little bit too high up. Let's join these objects together, but not to the door just yet. So we're gonna do that by making our selection. And in this case, I have no preference over where the origin is because I'm going to move it anyway. So Control and J to join it. And now I just want to fix the origin. And how I'm going to do that with the 3D cursor snapping that we went over in a previous video. So in face select mode, I want the origin to be exactly on the center, but on this face. So I'm just going to select this entire face. I'm going to press Shift and S to pull up the snapping menu and hit cursor to selected. Now I'm going to tab into object mode, going to right click, going to come down to set origin and click origin to 3D cursor. Again, this should all be review. Cool. So I'm just gonna reset my 3D cursor so it's not obstructing my view by pressing Shift C. And then we can put the doorknob on the other side just by duplicating it. Shift D, Y for the axis. And now we want to flip it completely in this direction. So I'm in right orthographic. So all I have to do is press R and 180 and then place it. Looks pretty good. So we can join all these together if we like. And then of course I'm going to make the door selection my last active. This is another thing about selection order and joining is it matters not only for the pivot, which should be here for a door, but we covered that already. But it also matters for the names. So if you watch the names up here of all these objects, I didn't name the doorknobs. And when I joined the two pieces of the doorknob together, I joined the sphere to the cylinder, so it maintains the name of your active selection. So if I select the knob and the knob, which are just named cylinder, because I didn't rename them, if I then select the door, I'm just making sure I have my selection order right. So now the door is my active selection. If I Control J, it will maintain the name door. Now, if I had done this in the wrong order, not only would the pivot point be wrong, but when I press Control J, it is now called cylinder.001, which we don't really want. So just remember that the active object it's going to maintain all the properties of the active object. So just make sure that what you want is active. And you'll see that I'm getting some shading errors here because these objects did not have a uniform scale, and they still do not, which you can tell in by bringing up the sidebar by pressing N and viewing these things here. Now, if these are all 1, it should fix these things here. But if I change it this way, it's going to scale the mesh. So we need to apply the scale, which we've done in a previous video. But again, to do that, just make your selection in object mode. Hold Control, press A to bring up this apply menu, and just apply the scale. Now it's fixed that shading error we had right here. All right, that's a good, nice basic door. So let's continue on. All right. And I brought everything back again just by pressing slash. You know, I'm being a little bit repetitive here, but I know that these hotkeys, there's just a lot of them, and there's not always the easiest to memorize. So I think just repetition is the best way to memorize these things. Still have proportional editing on, which I do not really need right now. So let's turn it off. All I did was add a cube, scale it down. And you'll notice if I scale something in edit mode, actually this is a good point to make. So if I have this cube and I scale it down to approximately that size, in object mode, the scale of it is 0.086, and that's because I did it on the object level. However, this cube, I added it, I tabbed into edit mode, and then I scaled it. So you'll see that the scale remains at 1. So just remember that doing things in object mode is a good way to sort of preserve the history of the object, I guess is the best way to say it. Because now if I reset these values to 1 of the cube that I reset, or I scaled in object mode, if I reset these values to 1, it brings it back to the default size, which is 2 by 2 by 2. But for this one, because I scaled it in edit mode, its scale of 1 is now equal to a dimension of 0.13 meters. So if I were to scale this in object mode and then clear that by pressing Alt and then S to clear the scale back to 1, it now reads this as the default scale for this object. You know, it's sort of heady and conceptual, but you will get the hang of it the more you use these objects and scale these objects. Again, repetition is kind of key here. Okay, so I'm just lining this up to make a simple frame. And we did this with multiple cubes in the past. The way we were making frames for our doors was by adding a cube here and scaling it, adding a cube here and scaling it, and adding a cube here and scaling it, and then joining those objects. And that's a valid way to do it, but I just want to show you another way. So we now have it scaled to the approximate width. We'll probably change it a little bit, but just get it roughly the size you want it. And now tab into edit mode. We're going to select this top face. We're going to hit E to extrude it, and we're just going to extrude it to the top. And it's easier to line up if you are in orthographic view. And we don't actually need this edge loop, so we're going to delete it. We're going to alt-click to select it, X, edge loops. Okay, so now we need to basically extend that around. So we need it to come up, and then we need to extrude from the face that is created here across. So we need to make one more extrusion in the vertical direction. E to extrude. So now we have this face here that we can extrude across this way. And we're just going to do the same thing and go all the way around. E. Line it up roughly. So it looks like this is roughly 10 centimeters, one of these major grid lines. So let's just line it up like that, just to try to get the thickness even on both sides. And obviously you can spend much more time, you can turn on snapping, you know, you can get the measurements exact, but this is just to demonstrate how you would use these skills practically modeling something. So that looks a lot better than the doors we've been making, for sure. It's more detailed anyway. So I'm gonna pause the recording here and just take a little break, and then when we come back, we're gonna finish out this room.